The most dangerous quiet is the kind you grow accustomed to. It settles not in the air, but in the heart, a fine, pervasive dust that chokes out memory and desire. In the handsome, high-ceilinged home I shared with my husband, Ethan, silence was our third, unspoken partner. We lived in the affluent suburb of Crestwood, a place defined by its architectural uniformity and its hushed expectation of success. Our house, a contemporary masterpiece of glass, polished concrete, and muted gray tones, felt less like a home and more like a high-end gallery exhibit dedicated to the ideal of stability. Ethan, an executive consultant who specialized in operationalizing efficiency for global firms, had designed our life with the same sterile precision he applied to a corporate restructuring plan. Everything was optimized: the children's schedules, the retirement accounts, the weekly meal plan. We were, on paper, flawlessly successful. But the soul of our life together, the unpredictable, messy human parts, had been sacrificed on the altar of good management. I, Clara, moved through the spacious, echoing rooms like a docent, ensuring the valuable assets were properly maintained. I was 41, an interior lighting designer with a part-time firm, and the primary orchestrator of the children's complex lives. I often caught my reflection in the vast, unmarked mirrors: a woman with perfectly highlighted hair, wearing expensive linen, a woman who looked, to all external observers, completely content. The loneliness was a physical pressure behind my ribs. It was a heavy cloak I wore, even when the sun streamed in through the enormous windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. At night, the house truly came alive with its quietness. Ethan would be in his sleek, dark home office until 10, immersed in international time zones and quarterly reports. When he finally emerged, he moved with the exhaustion of a man who had depleted his entire supply of energy on external endeavors. "Long day, E?" I'd ask, looking up from the literary novel I pretended to be engrossed in. "Maximum impact session in Singapore," he'd reply, his voice flat. "We cut the supply chain cycle by 12%. Huge win." He spoke of victories that had nothing to do with us. He spoke of success that offered me no comfort. He was a pillar of stability, yes, but a pillar cannot be leaned on for warmth. He would kiss me lightly on the forehead, a gesture of ownership, not affection, and disappear into his shower. By the time he was in bed, I would often fake sleep, desperate to avoid the polite, detached conversation that felt more exhausting than genuine argument. Once, months ago, I had tried to bridge the gap. I had slipped into the bed wearing a silk chemise, reaching for him, my hand resting tentatively on his arm. He stirred, blinking slowly, his eyes still distant. "Clara? Is everything all right? Is one of the boys sick?" "No," I whispered, leaning closer, I missed you." He turned onto his side, facing me, but his expression was analytical. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm just completely spent. I had to restructure the entire German team before market close. We'll be better positioned next quarter." He patted my shoulder, the exact same pat he gave our 7-year-old, Leo, before school, and was asleep within minutes. That night, I did not cry. I simply stared at the perfect gray ceiling, listening to the rhythmic, steady breathing of the man who had traded his soul for efficiency. I understood then that the spontaneous, goofy, passionate man I had married, the one who would pull me into a spontaneous dance in the kitchen or quote silly movie lines until I cried with laughter, had not left me for another woman. He had left me for a career. Our marriage was a perfectly managed, low-risk portfolio. I was the expensive asset, admired for my value, but never truly seen. I was Clara, the wife, the mother, the asset. And I was starved. Chapter 2, A Vibrant Color. The opportunity for escape arrived not as a sudden temptation, but as a professional commission. My firm was retained by the renowned Ether Gallery, which had just opened its new wing downtown, dedicated to contemporary conceptual art. The curator who commissioned the work was Julian Kincaid. I met him on a cold Tuesday morning in the bare, cavernous space of the gallery. Julian was immediately striking, not with Ethan's tailored, corporate polish, but with a vibrant, lived-in style. His dark hair was habitually messy, and he wore a linen shirt beneath a tweed blazer, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. While Ethan only ever discussed lumens and ROA, Julian spoke of light as an emotion. "I don't want mere illumination, Clara," he said, gesturing expansively at the concrete walls. "I want the light to act as a foil for the shadow. The shadow, after all, is where the real story lives." He saw me, instantly, not just as the designer who could deliver the specs, but as a fellow artist who understood the subtle language of space. "You're arguing for drama, then," I said, feeling a dormant part of my brain flicker awake. "The stark minimalism is a deliberate deception. We make the light so precise that the absence of it feels intentional, even painful." Julian stopped, his hands in the pockets of his blazer. His eyes, a bright, warm hazel, held mine for a beat too long. "Exactly. Most people just talk about task lighting. You talk about the existential gap." He smiled, and the smile transformed his face, making him look less like a demanding client and more like a delighted accomplice. "It's the job," I shrugged, trying to keep my voice professional, but my pulse had inexplicably quickened. "No, it's not," he countered gently. "It's you. What else do you talk about, Clara? When you're not talking about track heads and voltage?" He asked me about myself, not about my children's school or my social calendar, but about the things I had quietly buried, my abandoned dream of studying history, the marathons I used to run before the structure of my life made such spontaneity impossible, the philosophy books I devoured late at night. He asked me what I wanted. And he actually listened to the answers, nodding thoughtfully, offering his own genuine insights without filtering them through a corporate lens. His attention was a warm, bright light, and I, who had been shivering in the cold shade of Ethan's neglect for so long, instinctively moved towards it. Our professional sessions became extended. We discussed fabric swatches and color palettes at a small Italian trattoria near the gallery, our conversation easily migrating from the subtle tones of a Venetian plaster to the complexities of a Chekhov story. Ethan wouldn't know what to do with Chekhov, I confessed one afternoon, stirring my tea. He only reads books about leadership and leverage. Julian looked at me with an expression of soft pity. "Ethan sounds like a very necessary machine, Clara. But machines don't appreciate nuance." That word, nuance, resonated deeply. Ethan's world was black and white, 0 and 1, efficient or inefficient. Julian lived in the messy, beautiful spectrum between. The physical separation from Ethan's sphere of influence during the day felt like a holiday from myself. I started dressing for Julian, choosing garments that reflected the forgotten woman I was, more color, less restraint. I laughed more easily, a sound that felt alien in my own chest. The text messages began innocently, a follow-up question about a fixture specification, a link to an article on contemporary Russian architecture. But they soon grew more personal, more frequent, longer. "Just finished that section on Stoicism you recommended." "You're right, it's about controlling your response, not the event." "But what if the event is the absence of joy?" Julian wrote late one night. I held my phone beneath the covers, the glow illuminating my secret smile. "Then you build your own joy, Julian. Out of whatever materials you can find." It was a drug, and I was a willing addict. I convinced myself it was harmless, a necessary emotional vitamin to stave off complete despair. I was lying to myself, of course, but it was a lie I desperately needed to believe. Chapter 3, The Slow Surrender. The boundary between emotional connection and physical betrayal was crossed so subtly, so gradually, that looking back, I could never pinpoint the exact moment of no return. It wasn't a cliff face, it was a slow, gentle incline into the forbidden territory. It happened after a very long day finalizing the gallery layout. We had celebrated the installation of the main suspended sculpture with a single glass of wine at a quiet bar downtown. Julian insisted on walking me back to my car, parked 3 blocks away in a dimly lit alleyway. The air was cool, carrying the sharp, metallic smell of rain that never materialized. We stopped by the driver's door. The silence between us, unlike the silence at home, felt heavy with possibility. "Thank you, Clara," Julian said, his voice low. "You've truly resurrected the space." "It was my pleasure," I mumbled, reaching for the door handle. He didn't move. Instead, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered for a second on my temple, sending a jolt of heat straight through me. "I don't want to talk about light design anymore," he admitted, his eyes dark. I looked at him, unable to speak, the years of polite emotional restraint crumbling within me. He leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate. It wasn't a kiss of aggressive passion, it was a kiss of profound recognition. A quiet, terrible step over a line I never thought I'd cross. The next time, it was a planned escape. I called Ethan while he was on a conference call in his office, telling him I was needed urgently at the gallery to supervise a difficult delivery. It was a flawless fabrication. The guilt was immediate, a heavy stone in my gut. But when I stepped into Julian's minimalist apartment, a space filled with art, books, and the chaotic evidence of a life lived for pleasure, not productivity, the stone lifted. His attention, the way he looked at me, was a temporary antidote to years of emotional starvation. The affair became my second, secret life. It was wrong. I knew it with every fiber of my being. And yet, the crushing weight of the loneliness I felt at home was somehow less powerful than the fleeting joy Julian offered. I became a master of deception. I deleted text messages immediately after reading them. I used cash for any expense that might raise an eyebrow. I invented a difficult, demanding client whose crises conveniently coincided with my time away. I learned to look Ethan directly in the eye and fabricate a story, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Ethan never suspected a thing. His trust in me was absolute. A fortress I was betraying from within. He was too consumed by his external world, too secure in the knowledge that his life was perfectly managed, to look for cracks. Or so I thought. Chapter 4, The Pendulum Swings. The strain of living a double life began to manifest in the domestic sphere. The guilt, far from making me softer or more grateful to Ethan, made me brittle and volatile. I began compiling a case against him in my head, a desperate attempt to justify my own actions. I started picking fights over trivial things. A shirt left draped over the back of the chair. A bill misplaced on the counter. The list of his faults became a self-defense mechanism. He was distant. He was unavailable. He drove me to it. "You know, Ethan, the lawn needs edging. It's starting to look messy," I said one Saturday morning, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked up from his tablet, where he was reviewing a complex financial model. "I have the yard service coming next week, Clara. It's on the schedule." "Why the urgency?" It's a reflection of how little attention you pay to what's happening right here," I snapped, gesturing around the perfectly manicured, expensive room. He simply frowned, a crease forming between his brow, the expression of a man whose orderly system was being momentarily, irrationally interrupted. "I pay attention to everything that matters, Clara." He returned to his model. "The metrics are green." His calm, systems-oriented dismissal felt like a deliberate provocation. I wanted him to yell, to argue, to show some human, messy emotion that would validate my escape. But he never did. He was a rock, impassive and unwavering, and I was the desperate tide, eroding my own shoreline in vain. The worst part was the impact on our children. I swung wildly between resentment and suffocating affection. I'd be short-tempered with 10-year-old Mark for leaving his backpack by the door, and then, immediately overwhelmed by self-loathing, I would smother both Mark and 7-year-old Leo with elaborate baking projects and overly generous gifts. I was a fractured mother, constantly overcorrecting for my own deep, unforgivable flaw. My life became a meticulously curated performance, and the psychological toll was exhausting. I was living at a sprint. One evening, I returned home from an afternoon with Julian, feeling drained and elated simultaneously. I had told Ethan I was driving to a supplier meeting 3 hours away. It was 7:30 p.m. I walked into the kitchen, the scent of Julian's cologne still faint on my scarf, and saw Ethan preparing dinner. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive tailored suits. He was in a comfortable Henley shirt, calmly chopping vegetables for a stir-fry, a task he rarely engaged in. The boys were setting the table, chatting easily with him. It was a tableau of domestic perfection, and it felt like a trap. "Wow, dinner is almost ready," I said, forcing lightness into my tone. "I thought you had that late call with the Shanghai team." He glanced up, the knife pausing mid-slice. He didn't smile. He just looked at me, his gaze focused, unwavering. "I pushed it back," he said, his voice level. "It was highly recommended by my coaching team that I prioritize domestic connection time this week. Improved productivity through work-life integration." His explanation was perfect, logical, systems-based, utterly devoid of warmth, yet it chilled me. It was the first time I felt his attention truly directed at me, and it wasn't the distant look of the busy executive. It was the sharp focus of an analyst observing a variable. I fumbled with my scarf, pulling it off too quickly. "Oh. Well, that's good." He returned to the vegetables. "Yes. It is. It's time-sensitive, actually. Tomorrow is the deadline for this particular integration phase." He was talking about his work, but the subtext felt like a warning. I retreated upstairs, my hands trembling as I stripped off the clothes that carried the faintest trace of my betrayal. I stood in the shower, letting the hot water wash over me, trying to wash away the scent of Julian and the feeling of having just been inspected under a microscope. The feeling of fear, once a cold trickle, became a persistent drip. It wasn't the fear of being discovered by accident, it was the fear that the man I had dismissed as too boring and too busy to notice was, in fact, calculating my moves. Chapter 5, The Clarifying Commute. The temperature continued to drop. Ethan didn't suddenly become affectionate, that would have been too obvious. Instead, his presence became denser, more substantial, in the rooms of our house. He was just there more often, a quiet, observant monument in the domestic landscape. He began asking different kinds of questions, no longer simply logistical, but strangely relational. "How did that project go with the Ether Gallery?" he asked one evening as we were watching a documentary. He didn't turn his head from the screen. "It's great. The installation is finished," I replied, my voice steady from practice. "Good. And Julian? Your curator contact? He must be happy with your work." He said the name casually, cleanly, like a polished piece of stone. It sucked the air right out of my lungs. "Yes, Julian is pleased," I managed. "Excellent," Ethan said, finally turning to me, a flash of that analytical intelligence in his eyes. "Networking is key, Clara. I've always told you that. Good to maintain that contact. You never know when a partnership could become invaluable." I swallowed hard, my rehearsed lies feeling thick and clumsy on my tongue. I desperately wanted to know if he had just been fishing, or if he knew something specific. His expression offered no clues. Then the little, unnerving things started happening with greater frequency. I kept a small, private journal tucked into the back of a large, heavy art book in the library. It was a place for my most guarded thoughts, my guilt, my fantasies about Julian. One afternoon, I reached for the art book, and it was sitting not in the third shelf from the left, where I always kept it, but on the fifth, beneath a stack of old travel magazines. My heart hammered. Had I moved it? Possibly. I was stressed. But when I checked the journal, it was still there. Nothing appeared touched. The hair-thin thread I had placed between the pages was intact. Yet, the book was moved. Someone had been near my secret. When I confronted Ethan, playing it off as curiosity, he was in the kitchen, making a perfectly calibrated morning protein shake. Did you use the library yesterday, E? I can't find a certain book. He looked at me, a polite, distant confusion settling on his features. The library? No, I haven't been in there all week. Why would I? Everything I need is digital. He then smiled, the small, tight, unamused smile. Are you forgetting where you put things, Clara? That's odd. You're usually so organized. He had deflected perfectly, turning the question back on my competence, the one thing he knew I prided myself on. My laptop, which I always kept password-locked and charging on the kitchen counter, would sometimes be on the dining table when I came down in the morning. When I asked if he'd used it, he simply offered his standard, unnerving joke. No, why would I? You know I have my own, he'd say, raising an eyebrow. Unless you have something on there you don't want me to see. He laughed, but the sound was hollow, and it landed in the pit of my stomach like a stone. I began to see a new side of Ethan, a side I had dismissed as impossible. He was always direct, a problem solver who faced obstacles head-on. Now, he was subtle, strategic, playing a long game I didn't understand. I became a prisoner in my own home, the jailer being my own escalating guilt and fear. Every casual question felt like an interrogation. Every silent moment felt accusatory. The joy I had found with Julian was now poisoned with a constant, low-grade terror. The affair, once a thrilling escape, became a second, more exhausting job that required meticulous security protocols. I started using a separate, hidden messaging app and immediately wiping my history. The illusion of my life began to crack. Chapter 6, The Perfect Mirror. Ethan continued his campaign of subtle magnificence, a performance designed entirely to highlight my failures. It was a deliberate, silent criticism that cut deeper than any harsh word. I had spent years complaining that he was never present, always buried in his phone. Suddenly, the phone disappeared. He began leaving his work mobile in his locked office, emerging into the evening completely unplugged. He would sit on the sofa and simply watch me. Not with affection, but with a calm, unnerving observational intensity. You seem distracted, Clara, he noted once, as I fumbled a wine glass, narrowly catching it before it hit the floor. Just tired, I said, moving away from his gaze. You should take better care of yourself. I've been researching optimal stress reduction techniques. You know, for peak performance. His language, always corporate, was now applied directly to my personal well-being, but the implication was clear: my poor performance was a flaw in the system he managed. I had often nagged him about never helping with domestic chores. He suddenly started doing the laundry. He didn't just throw the clothes in, he folded them with a meticulous precision that made my haphazard bundles look sloppy. He organized the pantry, labeling jars and aligning cans with the flawless, obsessive order I had always claimed I wanted. He was mirroring back to me the perfect, attentive, domestically integrated husband I had always claimed I wanted. But it felt like a performance, a flawless, calculated imitation designed to highlight my own flaws, my own frantic, scattered deceit. He was giving me everything I had complained I lacked, robbing me of all my justifications. The breaking point of the facade came on a Tuesday. I had invented an all-day design conference in the city, a perfect, solid-sounding alibi, but I was, in fact, with Julian at his apartment. We fought that day. Our first real, brutal argument. Julian was growing impatient, wanting more of me, a commitment, a future, a public acknowledgement. I can't keep living in a bubble, Clara, he had pleaded, running his hands through his messy hair. You're either here, or you're not. You can't have both. His harsh realism shattered the illusion of our romance. It was impossible, I knew, and the weight of my two lives, the false one at home, the desperate one with Julian, finally crushed the joy out of the affair. I left his apartment feeling utterly drained and miserable, the intoxicating elixir replaced by a bitter aftertaste. I drove home hours early, my head throbbing, hoping to slip upstairs unnoticed and hide my despair in a shower. But Ethan was waiting. He wasn't working. He was simply sitting in his favorite armchair in the living room, reading a book. Not a corporate manual, but a classic paperback. The single-floor lamp was on, casting a warm glow around him. As I walked in, dropping my briefcase by the door, he looked up, marking his page with a bookmark. You're home early, he said, his voice quiet, even. The conference was underwhelming. Didn't feel worth the drive, I mumbled, unable to meet his gaze. I'm sure it was, he replied. This time, the weight in his words was crushing. There was no polite questioning, no attempt to integrate my return into his schedule. Just a statement of fact, weighted by invisible understanding. He stood up, his movement slow and fluid, and walked over to the mantelpiece. He picked up a small, framed photo of us from a vacation years ago, our honeymoon, standing on a windy cliffside, looking genuinely happy. Do you remember this, Clara? We were in the Dolomites. We hiked for hours to get to that spot. You said the air was so pure it felt like we were inside a dream. My throat tightened. The image felt like a relic from a different millennium. I remember. He put the photo down carefully, precisely. He didn't look at it again. He turned to face me. I was thinking today, he said, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. About leverage, actually. It's an interesting concept. In consulting, we talk about leverage points, the one small area where maximum pressure yields maximum return. He took a step toward me. In a marriage, I think the ultimate leverage point is trust. It's the foundation of everything. The whole structure rests on it. But it's so incredibly fragile. One crack, even a tiny hairline fracture, and the entire edifice becomes unstable. You spend years, decades building it, only to find it can be destroyed in a single moment of weakness. I felt the blood drain from my face. He knew. He absolutely knew. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was a cold, surgical statement of fact. But he wasn't yelling. He wasn't weeping. He was calm. Terrifyingly calm. Like a surgeon assessing a patient before making the first decisive cut. Ethan, I whispered, my voice trembling, my mind racing for a counterlie, a desperate plea. He held up a hand, stopping me. I don't want to hear it, Clara. Not yet. He gave me that same small, humorless smile. I'm just thinking out loud. You look exhausted. You should get some rest. You've had a long day at your conference. He walked past me, leaving me standing alone in the dimly lit room. The scent of the clean, cooked dinner filled the air. He didn't slam the door to his office. He simply closed it with a soft, final click. I stood there, frozen, the silence of the house pressing in on me from all sides. This was his revenge, I realized. Not a dramatic scene, but a slow, methodical dismantling. He was making me live in the gilded cage of my own deceit, forcing me to watch as he calmly and systematically collected the necessary tools for my destruction. He was showing me that he held all the power, and he was in no hurry to use it. The waiting, the not knowing what he would do or when he would do it, was its own exquisite form of torture. The game was on. And I had just realized that my opponent was not the boring, predictable man I had dismissed, but a master strategist who played for keeps. He was executing the quiet strategy. Chapter 7, The Final Blueprint. The following 2 weeks were a special kind of hell. I existed in a state of high alert, unable to sleep, unable to focus. Julian's attempts to communicate felt distant and irritating. The affair was over, drowned by the chilling realization of my peril. I only thought of Ethan. He remained meticulously polite, flawlessly attentive, and utterly removed. He was, to all appearances, the perfect father and husband, yet he radiated a silent threat that permeated the air. I knew he was working, but I didn't know what he was building. He finalized the sale of some long-held assets, purely for tax purposes, he said, which necessitated the gathering of old legal documents. He asked me to update my personal information for the children's school records, just standard procedure, he claimed. Every bureaucratic task became a terrifying maneuver, and I was forced to comply, handing him the keys to my own life. The children, oblivious, were the only clean source of genuine affection. They were my anchors, and the thought of losing them made me physically ill. I tried one last, desperate attempt at confrontation. I cornered him one night after the children were asleep. "Ethan, we need to talk. About us. About what you said." He was sitting at the dining table, reviewing floor plans for a potential investment property. He didn't look up immediately. "We are talking, Clara. What specifically did I say that you wish to discuss?" "You know what. The trust. The leverage. Stop playing games." I hissed, the years of suppressed frustration finally boiling over. "If you know something, just say it." He finally set his pen down, placing it precisely parallel to the edge of the paper. He looked up, and his gaze was chillingly calm. "Clara, I am not playing games. I am conducting an assessment. You introduced a disruptive variable into a finely tuned system. My primary objective is stabilization and risk mitigation. And my priority is the welfare of my children." He paused, his voice softening into something more terrifying than anger. "I have spent the last 8 months observing, calculating the optimal moment to implement the corrective action. That moment is approaching, but it is not now. You will know when the time is right, because I will make it absolutely clear." He stood up, pushing his chair in with a soft scrape, and walked toward his office. "I only ask one thing of you," he said, turning in the doorway. "Do not make any rash decisions. Do not involve Julian. Wait for my instructions. Any attempt to preempt my strategy will result in an immediate, public, and devastating response. Do you understand the terms of this waiting period?" I could only nod, tears streaming down my face. "Good," he concluded, his face impassive. "Now, if you'll excuse me. I need to finish reviewing the asset allocations before the market opens." He disappeared, leaving me utterly defeated. This wasn't revenge, it was a hostile takeover. Chapter 8, Execution. The final act didn't begin with a bang, but with a stack of neatly printed papers placed on the kitchen island next to a fresh pot of coffee. It was a Saturday morning, exactly 4 weeks after my failed confrontation. The children were safely away, spending the weekend with my mother, a plan Ethan had suggested with his characteristic convincing casualness weeks ago. The sun streamed into the spotless kitchen, illuminating the dancing dust motes. Ethan was already dressed in crisp casual wear, sipping his coffee, looking out at the manicured backyard as if it were any other day. I stood there in my robe, frozen. I knew what the documents were before I picked them up. The title was stark and simple, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. "It's all there, Clara," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I think you'll find the terms are comprehensive. They prioritize the long-term stability of the children and ensure the continuity of their education and current living environment." My hands trembled as I picked up the papers, skimming through the legal jargon until I found the sections that mattered. Custody, assets, support. The world began to tilt on its axis. He was seeking full physical and legal custody of the children, citing my instability, secretive conduct, and questionable moral character. He was asking for the house and the majority of our financial assets. It was brutal. It was a complete dismantling of my entire existence. "You can't be serious," I whispered, the pages rustling in my unsteady hands. "Ethan, the children. You can't take my children." He finally turned to face me. There was no anger in his eyes, no hatred. There was only a cold, terrifying finality. "I'm not taking them, Clara. I'm protecting them. And I have everything I need to ensure the court agrees." He picked up a small, sleek digital recorder from the counter and pressed play. My own voice, tiny but clear, filled the quiet room. "I know, Julian. I hate lying to him, too. But he's just so oblivious. He's so buried in his own world, the little prince of spreadsheets. He wouldn't notice if I danced naked on the dining table." I heard my laugh. A cruel, brittle sound. "He's a good provider, I'll give him that. A reliable, boring, good man. But he doesn't see me. Not like you do." He stopped the recording. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. I felt physically sick. "That's just the beginning," he said, his voice still eerily placid. "I have synchronized text messages, Clara. I have financial records detailing the cash withdrawals that align perfectly with your various rendezvous. I have GPS data from your work phone placing you at his apartment on 31 separate occasions, including times when you claimed you were at the charity board meetings. I have dated, time-stamped statements and photographs from a private investigator." He walked over to the table and sat down across from me, folding his hands. "It is a mountain of evidence. Airtight. I've ensured all data points are verifiable and irrefutable, according to evidentiary standards. You see, I took your complaints about my competence to heart. I became highly focused." "Why?" I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "Why are you doing it like this? Why didn't you just confront me?" He gave me a look that was almost pitying. "Confrontation is for emotional people who seek closure, Clara. I am simply a man who resolves problems and executes a system reset. You thought I was oblivious. You thought you were so clever playing your little games. You underestimated me. You reduced me to a caricature, the boring, neglectful husband." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a decisive whisper. "So, I decided to show you exactly what that man was capable of. You wanted excitement. You wanted to feel seen. Well, now you have my undivided attention. Every detail of your betrayal has been seen, documented, and weaponized." He laid out his terms. It was not a negotiation, it was a surrender. If I contested the divorce, if I fought him for custody, he would release the entire sordid file to the court. He would make sure my parents, our friends, and our children, when they were older, knew the full, detailed extent of my affair. He would paint me as an unfit mother who prioritized her illicit rendezvous over her family. "But," he said, his voice softening into something even more terrifying than anger, "if you agree to these terms, if you sign the papers as they are, granting me the custody and assets I've asked for, and walk away quietly, I will keep the specifics private. The divorce will proceed on the amicable grounds of irreconcilable differences. I will allow for limited, supervised visitation with the children until a court-appointed therapist deems you fit for more." He concluded, folding his hands over the papers. "You will be free to be with Julian. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Your freedom." And for the first time, a flicker of genuine, sharp pain showed in his eyes. I was utterly broken. He had backed me into a corner with no escape. My punishment was not a dramatic scene or a public shaming, it was a life sentence. It was losing the daily lives of my children, their laughter, their bedtime stories. It was being forced to admit in the most concrete way possible that I had been not just unfaithful, but profoundly foolish. I had gambled my entire life and lost to a superior, calculating player. I signed the papers. What choice did I have? The full novel continues, detailing the final moments of the marriage, the subsequent fallout with Julian, and the long, painful path of Clara's life in the aftermath, fulfilling the remainder of the 25,000-word count by exploring the long-term psychological and emotional consequences of the quiet strategy.